In Microsoft Azure, in the public cloud, we can configure conditional access. In other words, a number of conditions must be satisfied before allowing users to make a connection to Azure or cloud-based apps by authenticating through Azure. So conditional access then is known as rule-based access control. Now there are a couple of things that we should consider here, the first of which is that we can also enable multi-factor authentication or MFA. So here in the Azure portal, in the left, I'm going to open my navigator and drill all the way down to Azure Active Directory. To enable MFA for Azure AD users, we first have to go to the Users view on the left. I've got an existing user that was created by clicking New User up at the top. That user is named User1. Now to enable MFA for users, what we do is we click the multi-factor authentication button towards the upper right. That's going to open a new web browser window where I have a list of all my Azure Active Directory or AD users, and I have a column that shows me the status of MFA, which is currently showing disabled for all users. I'm going to put a check mark for user 1, and then over on the far right, I'm going to choose Enable to enable MFA. I will click the Enable Multi-Factor Authentication and close. So currently it's enabled. So the next time user 1 signs in, they're going to have to provide some more sign-in information for future logins, which will require multi-factor authentication. So I'm going to go ahead and close that window. Now let's go back to our default directory in the breadcrumb trail here. We're looking at the properties of Azure AD, Azure Active Directory. What I want to do is I want to make sure that we enable conditional access. Now the first thing I have to do here is scroll down, and on the left I need to click Properties. And then on the right, I'll scroll down to the bottom and click Manage Security Defaults, and I'm going to turn off Security Defaults because I'm going to select my organization is using conditional access, and I'll click Save. Now to configure conditional access, we would click on Security on the left, and from here I have conditional access policies that I can work with. Before we do that though, I'm going to create a configured named location. A named location can be referenced within a conditional access policy, so it can be one of the conditions that must be satisfied. The user must be signing in from a particular location. And we could add specific countries, IP address ranges. So I'm going to click Countries, and I'm going to add Canada. So I'll put in Canada as the name for it, and down below I'll have to make sure I filter that list and select Canada as well. So people must be signing in from Canada. So we'll just click that, and then Canada shows up as a named location. So I'm going to click Policies over on the left, and I'll click the New Policy button up at the top. So I'm going to call this Canadian Sign-ins. And I'm going to assign this to a specific group. For example, I'll click on Users and Groups, and over on the right I'll choose Select Users and Groups, and it's going to be users and groups that I select from Azure AD. I'm going to choose a group on the right here that I've already created called East Group 1. And it contains a number of members such as User 1. So I'm going to choose the group, and I'll choose Select. The next thing I want to do is make sure that we specify that the users must be coming from Canada. So for that on the left, I'll click under Conditions on the link, and on the right for Locations, which is currently showing not configured, I'll click on that. So what I want to do then is make sure that I choose Yes for Configure, and I'm going to choose Selected Locations, where I'm going to choose Canada, which we created previously. Then I'll choose Select for that. Next on the left under Access Controls, I'll click on the link under Grant. We could either block or grant access to people signing in from Canada. Well, specifically for members of East Group 1. So I want to grant access. Now at the same time, I could also require multi-factor authentication, and of course we've enabled that for user 1, which is a member of the group that is part of this conditional access policy. We could also require the device to be marked as compliant, so up to date with antivirus settings and so on. However, I'm just going to go ahead and enable MFA, and I'll turn that on. So at this point, the default in the bottom left is that it's in report-only mode. It will log this type of activity, but will not enforce it. So to actually enforce it, I would click On, and then I would click Create to create my conditional access policy. And after a moment, our Canadian Sign-ins policy is now created. So there are many different tools out there that let you create conditional access policies, such as for VPN authentication, maybe requiring clients or using a certain type of device. They're signing in from certain locations. They have a firewall enabled. They have up-to-date antivirus signatures, and so on. Two-factor authentication, also called two-step verification, is something that you can enable with a user account for a variety of different apps. Why would you do it? Isn't username and password enough? No, even though that's two items, username and password, they are both considered single factor because they're one category. They are something you know. So with two-step verification, we can make it a little bit more difficult for someone to try to break into a user account. We're going to go ahead and do that here with Google. We're going to enable Google two-step verification. So I've already gone to the Google landing page for this configuration in my web browser. So I'm going to go ahead and click Get Started. Then I'm going to specify the email address for a Google account, and I'm going to go ahead and click Next. Of course, I'll then have to enter the password for that account. Once I've done that, I can click Next to go through the two-step verification setup. So here we can protect our account with another layer of security as it says on the page. So we could have our password along with our email address and a unique verification code that can be sent to our phone, that type of thing. So I'm going to go ahead and click Get Started. I'll pop in my password, click Next, and here I'm being prompted to use my phone as a second step to sign in. If I go under Show More Options, I could also use a physical security key, like a YubiKey device, that I must have in my possession for signing in. So text messages sent to my phone, voice calls, all of that stuff. So currently, my Galaxy Android-based phone is being shown here. So that's the one that we're going to be using in my particular case for two-step verification. So I'm going to go ahead and click Continue. I'll make sure my phone number is specified. It's blurred out here, of course, for security reasons. And I'm going to make sure that it text messages me. I don't want to get a phone call. I want a text message sent to my device when I sign into this Google account. Now, if I scroll down, I can also choose Use Another Backup option. So I get a number of codes that I can save or print that I can use for signing in if for some reason I don't have access to my phone. So not a bad idea. And I'm going to click the Send button so it can send a confirmation code to my phone via SMS text message. And I'll go ahead and enter the code that was sent. So this is multi-factor authentication because besides having the knowledge of the username and password, I have to have my phone with me to enter in this code. So I'm going to go ahead and enter the code that was texted to my phone. So this is multi-factor authentication or two-step verification to be specific because I have to have knowledge of the username and password, and I must also possess my phone so I can receive this code and enter it in here. So I'm going to go ahead and click Next. Okay, once it's verified that that PIN was correct, it asks me, do you want to turn on two-step verification for this account? I'm going to go ahead and choose Turn On. Okay, now at any point in time, I can go ahead and turn that off. So let's see what happens when we sign in fresh using that Google account. So I'm going to go ahead in the upper right here and sign out, and we'll do a fresh sign in. So I'll select the account. I still need to know the password. I'll go ahead and put that in. And it automatically says, check your phone because we've sent a notification and I need to tap yes on the notification to continue. So on my phone, it's asking if I'm trying to sign into Google, which I am. So I can either opt in by saying, yes, this is me. Or if I'm not trying to sign in and someone's trying to hack my account, I can choose no, it's not me. So on my phone, I'm just going to tap yes because this is valid. And it's triggering me to sign in immediately on my laptop computer. It's always important to make sure that you limit access to a network in the first place, besides doing the standard hardening for all of the infrastructure devices and hosts on the network. So in this case, we're talking about a wireless network. Here I'm connected to a D-Link simulator for a Wi-Fi router. And the idea is that we want to make sure that we harden this network. We don't want the D-Link wireless router performing authentication. Instead, we want it to forward authentication requests off to a centralized Radius server. That means the D-Link wireless router then would be called a Radius client. Now, devices that try to connect to the Wi-Fi network would be referred to as supplicants. So let's get started with this. The first thing I want to do here is click Wireless Settings over on the left. We've got some standard Wi-Fi options here that we might choose to enable or disable or just change the settings of. For example, changing the wireless network name. Now, the last thing you want to do if this is a Wi-Fi router for Boardroom A in your building is to call it Floor 10 Boardroom A. We don't want to do that because it reveals way too much information. Now, even if you enable hidden wireless, so if you disable the SSID broadcast, there are still freely available tools that can still end up finding the name of your Wi-Fi network. So using a generic name is actually preferred, believe it or not. Now, we would only enable extended range mode if we wanted to make sure the signal was reachable from further away over a longer distance. Now, generally, we don't want to do that beyond a controlled perimeter, such as within the walls of a building. Now, down below, the security mode is currently set to disable wireless security, and it says not recommended. So this is an open wireless network. We don't want that. So here I could choose WEP, Wired Equivalent Privacy. The problem with that is that it only uses a 40-bit initialization vector, and it's known to be crackable easily in seconds. We could use WPA or WPA2, and if it supported it, WPA3, we could also choose that. So if I choose WPA2 Wireless Security Enhanced, down below it sets the cipher to TKIP, the Temporal Key Integrity Protocol, which means the key is not static like it is with WEP for every transmission. Instead, it's dynamic. It changes. However, we could also choose AES, the Advanced Encryption Standard. And instead of leaving it on personal, where we enter and confirm a passphrase, this is a pre-shared key, a PSK, and of course, any connecting device would have to know the same passphrase, so it's like a secret symmetric key. Instead of that, because remember, we said we don't want this Wi-Fi router performing authentication. We just want it to forward it off elsewhere. And so under Personal/Enterprise, I'm going to choose Enterprise. When you configure Enterprise mode, what you're really saying is, this is not home personal use, this is more of a business use, and we've got an authentication server elsewhere. So what it wants are the IP addresses of one or more Radius servers. So I'm going to go ahead and fill out the blanks. Now, by default, Radius uses port 1812, and we still have to enter a shared secret here that must be known, of course, by this device to be able to make a connection to the Radius server. The Radius server would have to be configured with the same shared secret. Now, Radius server is just a server configured to support the Radius standard. It could also be a Windows server. It could be a Linux server. It doesn't make a difference, but it is an authentication server where authentication actually takes place. So we need to make sure that that server is hardened and is only reachable by the appropriate devices, such as this one. Remember, this wireless router would be called a Radius client. So the benefit is that if, for example, this wireless router were actually compromised by a malicious attacker, well, then they wouldn't have access to a large set of credentials. The reason is because the credentials aren't stored here. The credentials are stored elsewhere on the Radius server. In a Windows environment, we can use dynamic access control, which can be based on user attributes in Active Directory to determine which permissions they are granted in the file system on Windows file servers. So the first thing that we have to do in order to use this functionality, which is different than just putting people in groups and the group automatically has permissions, this is based on the attributes of a user. To do this, we first have to turn on a group policy setting. So here on my Windows server, which is also a domain controller for an Active Directory domain, I'm going to go in the Start menu under Windows Administrative Tools, and I'm going to go down and select Group Policy Management. Now I'm then going to drill down under my forest hierarchy down to my domain, and I'm going to right-click and choose Edit to edit the default domain GPO or Group Policy Object. Next, I want to drill down under Computer Configuration on the left under Policies and under Administrative Templates, then under System. I'll just kind of widen this window a little bit. What I'm looking for under here is the Key Distribution Center for Active Directory, or KDC. I want to make sure I go into this KD support for claims, compound authentication, and Kerberos armoring. A claim in an identity management environment is an assertion made by an authority, an identity authority like Active Directory, with some details, such as the department a user is in, the IP address of their device, the type of device, whatever we configure. Those types of details are called claims. So I need to make sure then that we enable claims, and that down below it's listed as supported. Okay, next thing I'll do is click OK. Now that might take some time to propagate throughout your Active Directory domain, but I'm just going to go ahead and open up a command prompt and force it right away with gp update. So I'm going to run gp update /force. And then I'll exit out of there. So now I'm going to go into my Start menu, and what I want to do is I want to start the Active Directory Administrative Center. So from my Windows Administrative Tools, I'll choose Active Directory Administrative Center. And I'll maximize it, and on the left, I'm going to click Dynamic Access Control. Then I'll right-click Claim Types, and I'll choose New Claim Type. And down below in the list of attributes, I'm going to choose Department, which is a string value, and this is a claim that relates to users. Now, this depends on Active Directory admins having filled in the department attribute for user accounts in Active Directory. Now, down below under Suggested Values, we could specify some values by clicking Add. And let's say the value, would be sales, and that's also what the display name would be. This is a value for the department attribute, and maybe we'll add here HR for human resources, and that would be yet another valid value. So we can go ahead and do this when we are configuring claims. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK. So if I were to double click on claim types, we would have our newly created department claim. But remember that this option, Dynamic Access Control, is used to control access to Windows file systems. And so what I need to do then is I need to make sure that for Dynamic Access Control, we configure resource properties. Now, what's a resource? Didn't we just do that? Well, we configured access to user attributes in Active Directory, specifically for a department. However, a resource in this context is a file or a folder in the file system. So really it should say file or folder properties. What I want to do is make sure that the department property is enabled. I need to right-click and choose Enable. Notice that the icon changes. Now the next thing I'm going to do is go into my Start menu on my server and fire up Server Manager. This is because I need to add some software here so that we can use that department property in the file system, basically to match that people are from a certain department and that they should have certain access to files flagged for that department. Okay, so I'm going to click Add Roles and Features. I'll click Next, and I'm just going to keep going through the wizard accepting defaults until I get to the Roles screen. I want to make sure under File and Storage Services that I expand File and iSCSI services, and I'm interested in File Server Resource Manager, FSRM. So I'm going to select that and tell it I also want the tools for that. This is important when you want to do comparisons with properties or when you want to classify data on a Windows file system. So I'm going to go ahead and click Next and accept all of the defaults to continue on through the rest of this wizard. Okay, once that's done, I'm just going to go ahead and click Close, and I'm going to go to my Start menu, and under Windows Administrative Tools, we will now see in the Fs that we have File Server Resource Manager. That's the role service we just installed. Now, if I open that tool up, I'm interested in classification management, where we can classify or assign tags, metadata, properties to file system items. So if I expand that and go to Classification Properties, here's the department global attribute that we enabled. That was the resource property we enabled through the Active Directory Administrative Center. Now, if you don't see that, you could click refresh. It just might be out of date. So it's good to see that that is there. So now we can couple the two together. What I mean is looking at Active Directory user attributes, and if they're in the right department, they have certain file system privileges to files flagged for that department. So let's open up, let's say, Windows Explorer. I've got a sample file on drive C under Projects. So I'm going to select Project A, let's say, and right-click and choose Properties. Because I've installed File Server Resource Manager, I have this classification tab showing up. So I'm going to click on it. The department is currently set to none, but what we can do is select from the values down below. Now, these aren't the values that we entered. We entered the values that we were checking for Active Directory user department items. This is the department we're assigning at the file system level, so Department of Sales, let's say. The idea being for users that have the Department of Sales set in Active Directory, that'll match files flagged as sales, and we want to give read and write access to them. So I am manually configuring that. Now I could go back into the File Server Resource Manager and configure classification rules that run on a schedule that might look for certain things in files and flag them as sales. But I've just flagged it manually, and that's okay for now. So I'm going to close the File Server Resource Manager, and I'm going to close my file system in Windows Explorer. That puts us back in the Active Directory Administrative Center. So I'm going to click on Dynamic Access Control on the left, and I'm going to click Central Access Rules. We don't have any, so on the right, I'll click New, and then Central Access Rule. Call this Central Access Rule 1 Sales. Down below, what I want to do is I want to target specific resources. So I'm going to click Edit, and I will click Add a Condition. So the resource, remember, is a file or a folder. So we could look at various properties. The only one that we've enabled, remember, here centrally is department. And so we can say if it equals a value of sales, then we want this central access rule to apply. So this is for file system resource that have a department that equals sales. Down below, we can say use the following permissions as current permissions, and we could click edit here to add certain principals. For example, I could choose select a principal. Let's say I put in domain users, which is a group, and I'll click OK. However, I don't just want every domain user to have read and I'll turn on write permissions to sales files. Instead, I'm going to add a condition. And I'm going to select that the user department, this is an Active Directory, must equal, and this is what we filled in, let's say, sales. And I'll click OK and OK. And then OK again. So now we've got our central access rule. Now I'm going to go into central access policies. I have to build a central access policy. I'm going to call this central access policy 1. Down below, I have to add the rules that we've created, central access rule 1 sales. You could have more than one. And then I'll click OK. Now, the final piece of this is that I need to go back into group policy to tell it to deploy this central access policy to the objects in Active Directory that it should apply to. So I'm going to go back into my Start menu, down into Windows Administrative Tools, and in the G's, I'm going to go into Group Policy Management. And again, I'm going to drill down to my domain level GPO, and I'm going to right-click on it and edit it. On the left, I'm going to drill down under Policies, Windows Settings, and then Security Settings, and we're talking about file system security. So I'm going to go down and specify Central Access Policy. Now, there's nothing here until we right-click and choose Manage Central Access Policies. There it is, Central Access Policy 1. I'll click Add and OK. Now, the idea here is that this group policy setting we've done in the default domain policy will apply to all file servers joined to this Active Directory domain. Otherwise, you could scope it out by OUs and so on. So that setting needs to be put in effect for Windows file servers to allow users in Active Directory configured in the sales department to have access to files in the file system flagged as sales. So if we were to go, let's say, back into the Start menu under Windows Administrative Tools, and let's say we go into Active Directory users and computers, this is where we'd have to make sure users are configured with the appropriate properties. So when I create or modify existing users, if I just open up User Properties, we are interested here under the Organization tab in the department. This is where we'd have to enter sales in order for that to match our policy, which gives read-write access to files flagged for sales. Passwords are still widely used as an authentication mechanism, and so it's going to be important then to implement security policies to enforce password settings. Things like complex password requirements where we might have to have a mixture of upper and lowercase letters, numbers, symbols, maybe no repeating letters one after another. that type of thing. Maybe setting the minimum password length to 8 characters and requiring password changes every 60 days. All of those things are part of a password policy. And we could configure it on an individual Windows device, such as a Windows client machine not joined, let's say, to an Active Directory domain. You can configure group policy locally on it with those settings. But in this case, I'm going to do it centrally in Active Directory, specifically through group policy. And so here on my server, I will start by going into the Start menu, and under Windows Administrative Tools, I'm interested in Group Policy Management, so I need to go down to the G's to get to that. Now, when I launch the Group Policy Management Editor, or tool, the editor comes next, I can drill down in my Active Directory hierarchy. So I'm going to drill down under my domain, domain1.local, and here I've got a default domain policy. Every Active Directory domain has this, in which we can configure literally thousands of settings, including password settings. So I'm going to go ahead and right-click on that and choose Edit. That takes me into the Group Policy Management Editor, where on the left, I'm going to drill down under Computer Configuration, and I'm going to go down under Policies. I'm going to go down under Windows Settings. Then I'll expand Security Settings. I'll just widen out this panel a little bit. And I'm interested in, under Account Policies, the Password Policy. So when I select that, over on the right, I have a number of items that can be configured. For example, enforcing the password history is currently set to remember the last 24 passwords. Now that goes hand in hand with the minimum password age of 1 day, which I'm going to bump up, by the way, to be 30. What this means is users won't be able to reset their password right away, one time after another. They're going to have to wait at least 30 days each time. And coupled with the fact that it's going to remember the last 24 passwords, so users can't reuse that, this is a good thing. It means we can ensure users have unique passwords. I'm going to set the maximum password age here, let's say, to 60 days in accordance with organizational security policies. That's when the password absolutely must be changed. Currently, the minimum password length is 7 characters. I'm going to bump that up to 8. And I can also make sure that password complexity is enabled, which it is. But while we're here, we've also got the account lockout policy, which is currently not defined. So I'm going to go ahead and double click on the account lockout threshold. I'm going to set that to a value of 3. Basically, after 3 incorrect login attempts, I want the user account locked. And I want that timed. When I click OK, it's got some default settings, including for the timing, which is set to 30 minutes. I want it to be 60 minutes. So I want the account lockout duration to be 60. And I also want to set the other policy value for resetting the account lockout to be 60 minutes. Now, this is great because if we've got brute force password attacks that keep hammering accounts with a multitude of passwords, this will kick in and thwart that attempt. These days, attackers are a little bit more suave. What they will often do is use a technique known as password spraying, where they will have, for example, a password that they want to use or try against an account, but they will try it against many accounts. So it's very slow, and then they'll cycle around and try another password against all of the accounts. This way, we aren't hammering a bunch of passwords to one account all at the same time. And so that is one way that attackers will try to get around these account lockout type of policy settings. Now, you need to be careful, because if I were, let's say, to create a group policy object for an OU, so let's do an example. Let's say I go into my Start menu under Windows Administrative Tools and Active Directory Users and Computers because I want to build an organizational unit. So under Domain 1 Local, I'm going to right-click and choose New, Organizational Unit. Let's say I'm going to call it East_region. Okay, so now in there, I could create user accounts, group accounts, could create computer accounts, and essentially have them organized under that OU. So back here in the Group Policy Management tool, if I click Refresh at the top, there's East Region. I could right-click on that here and create a GPO and link it to that OU. East Region _settings. That's the name of the group policy object or the GPO. Okay, that's cool. So now if I right click on East Region Settings and go into Edit, then within here I can do pretty much the same thing that we just did. I can configure any setting, but we're talking about password policy type of settings. So down under Policies, Windows Settings, Security Settings, Account Policies, here's Password Policy. Let's say, for example, that what we're going to do here is set the maximum password age. Well, let's say we're going to set that to 5 days. That's vastly different from what we did in our other GPO. I'm going to go ahead and OK that. Now, let's close that out because you also have a domain controllers OU, and the server we're sitting at here is actually a domain controller. And if we go back to Active Directory users and computers under domain controllers, here it is. It's called server 1. If we were to open up a command prompt and type host name, this is server 1. Okay, so let's say I wanted to apply password policy settings that would affect only domain controllers. So I could do that by going into the domain controllers GPO. Let's go back to group policy. There it is. So I could right click on it and edit it and do the exact same thing again. What we're seeing here is we can set the same settings at different levels. Now, depending on where user accounts or computer accounts reside in the Active Directory hierarchy will determine which group policy object settings are applied. So let me just go back here into password policy real quick. Let's say we're going to set the maximum password age here to 10. Okay, so at the domain controller level, the maximum password age is set to 10. If we double check our work, the default domain policy, if we go back and drill down to the same location, the maximum password age is not set to 10, if you recall. If we go down and take a look at it, the maximum password age here is 42. Okay, why am I doing this? Well, you'll see. What I want to do is make sure I now put those group policy settings into effect. Now, I can either wait, and depending on your Active Directory replication topology, you might wait a few minutes, you might wait 90 minutes, a couple hours. It just depends. But I can force group policy to apply immediately by going into a command prompt on this host. So to force it to update on this host, I can run gp update /force. So we'll wait for it to update the policy. And so an important point to be made here is that only the domain level group policy object password settings will apply to domain users, even if you've configured GPO settings related to the password policy for GPOs linked to organizational units where users have their accounts. The settings will not apply, only from the domain level GPO. There are plenty of ways of cracking passwords. In the case of a Linux system, we could do it live by trying to brute force accounts. Same thing with the Windows system. Of course, if password policies have intruder detection or lockout settings, accounts might be locked out after a number of subsequent attempts. However, password spraying is a technique that a lot of malicious users will use to use the same password against many accounts, so it's not in quick succession, before looping back and enumerating through all the accounts again and trying another password. The other thing to watch out for is that if you have hashed passwords, especially if they're not salted with some kind of random data, it makes it much quicker for attackers to break them. So here, we're going to take a look at how to use John the Ripper. This is an old tool that's still valid today that can allow us to crack passwords for things like zip files or Linux hashed passwords. So I'm using Kali Linux and I'm connected here as user root. And what I'm going to do for starters is add a new user account here in Linux using the user add command. I'm going to create a user called C Blackwell, and I'm going to use the password command PASSWD to set a password for user C Blackwell. Type in the password and I'll confirm it, and it's done. It says it was updated successfully. Now note, if you're not logged in as user root, you might need to prefix all of these commands with the sudo command to run them in elevated privileged mode. Now, if I were to, let's say, run the tail command to show the last few lines of a text file, let's start by doing a tail of /etc password. We can see we've got user C Blackwell listed here. So that account has been created, but there's no password reference here because the password by default is stored in /etc shadow. And we can see here that we've got user C Blackwell and a hash for that person's password. And that's what we're interested in trying to crack in this particular case using John the Ripper. John the Ripper includes a command called unshadow, where you can put together some credential files, essentially lump them into a single file that you use for the attack. So of course, never do this on a system that you don't own or a system that you don't have express permission to use for this purpose. But here it is a system I own, so there's no danger. So I'm going to use unshadow. I'm going to specify I want to lump together the etc password file and /etc shadow. And let's say we'll output that using the output redirection symbol, the greater than sign, to a file called creds.txt. Okay, so if I cat the creds.txt file, all right, looks like we've got the contents here, including, of course, the password hash information. So looking good. So I'll clear the screen with the clear command. Now what I'm going to do is run the John command, and I'm simply going to specify the name of the file, the creds.txt file. And I'm going to press enter and let it start doing its thing. And it doesn't take very long for it to determine that the password for user C Blackwell is green. So I'm going to go ahead and press Control C. Now you can also, I'll just clear the screen, run the John command with --show after the fact, specify the file, in this case creds.txt, to get a listing of all the passwords that it managed to figure out. And here we just have one password hash that was cracked. In this case, it's the password for user C Blackwell. So we want to make sure that we limit access to a host in the first place. Naturally, this only succeeded because I had access to some sensitive files on this host. Remote Desktop Protocol, or RDP, is what's commonly used to remotely manage Windows hosts using a GUI. So here in my Windows server, I'm just going to open up the Start menu and search for Remote and click on Remote Desktop Settings. So the first thing is we need to make sure that on a given Windows host that Remote Desktop is enabled and that a firewall rule allows the traffic in. So in this case, Remote Desktop is turned on. Now what I want to do is switch over to the command line so we can take a peek at whether RDP is in a listening state. So I'm going to use my up arrow key to go back through previous commands, and I'm going to run one that I've used recently. It's netstat/p. We're looking for the TCP protocol /a, and then we're going to pipe that to find string, and I'm looking for 3389 because Remote Desktop Protocol listens on RDP port 3389. And indeed, on this particular host, it is showing up as being in a listening state. Now, this is fine on an internal network, but you don't want to do this on a public-facing network, only because if this gets scanned and discovered, there are many brute force RDP type of attacks that can be executed against the host. Let's just check out this host IP config. It returns back 192.168.4.117. So here in Kali Linux, I'm going to run an nmap scan on my subnet to make sure that host is discovered. So I'm going to run nmap-p for port, looking for port 3389, and I'll specify 192.168.4.0/24. That is my subnet. So let's go ahead and give that a moment to see what we get. Okay, so if we go back through the output, we'll be able to tell whether port 3389 over the TCP transport is closed or whether it's up and running. If we scroll up and take a look, we're going to see one that's open, but it's not the server that we expected. So there's another host up on the network that has that in a listening state, or rather a filtered state. So why isn't our host showing up? It's probably because it's firewalled, and so any scans against it won't reveal it. But let's turn off the firewall and take a look. Okay, so naturally you don't turn off the firewall just for kicks. We only do it for testing purposes on non-production systems. So to do that, here from the command line, since we're already here, I can run netsh netshell advanced firewall, and I'm going to set all firewall profiles to a state of off. So it says okay. Let's go back and let's actually run a scan directly against this IP, 117, to see whether or not it shows up in our nmap output. So back here in Kali Linux, I'm going to run nmap again, and we're going to do pretty much the same thing. -P for port, and we're going to do once again 3389, except this time 192.168.4.117. And so this time we have port 3389 actually wide open. So it doesn't take much for an attacker to perform reconnaissance scans to discover these hosts in the first place. So what do they do next? Let's check it out. Okay, so I've changed directory into the /usr/share/wordlists folder. And if I clear the screen and do an ls, I've got a file here called rocku.txt. That was a zipped file, and I simply used the sudo g unzip command to unzip it to this text file. What is it? It's a large text file with a lot of different passwords in it. For example, if I use the Linux head command to ask for the first few lines in that file, then we'll see some of the passwords that are in there. Now, there are many more than this. What I've done to speed this up is I've put in the password that I know is being used for RDP on the host we discovered. Realistically, you would let it go through the entire list. Actually, let's see how big this is. If I were to run cat against the rocku.txt file, it just goes and goes and goes on and on and on and on and on. So I'm going to go ahead and press Control-C to quit out of that. Now, really, we probably don't need to go through this many passwords because year after year, the most common passwords are things like, I'll just type it in here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and stuff like that, or the word password. So usually it's not that hard to break into a lot of these things because on the whole, most users and technicians don't use complex passwords, although of course that should be happening. So let's make this all come together using the Hydra tool. I'm going to use the Hydra tool and specify -L, that's lowercase l, we're in Linux, so that matters. The administrator account is what I'm going to test, -P, and I'm going to specify the word list here. That would be the rocku.txt file, and then I'm going to specify RDP : / and then 192.168.4 and 117 was the IP address of that host. So at this point, it's trying to attack the RDP port on that machine. Naturally, disclaimer, don't do this on machines you don't own or have express written consent to do this to, such as for a penetration test, because you could end up getting yourself in hot water. Don't use these tools randomly over the internet. Plus, it's not ethical. Now we can see very quickly down below that for the host that we specified, it was able to successfully log in as administrator with the password that I fed into the file, of course. But the point is that it read the file, it applies everything, and it finally was able to find the password for that host. That's pretty easy, and we're talking about using freely available tools, and anybody can do this by watching a tutorial or watching this video. You can just take a few minutes and figure out how to do it. And so we want to make sure then RDP ports are not exposed to the internet because it's just way too easy for this to happen, which also lends credence to being very careful about who we let on our networks in the first place. So using network access control and MAC address filtering, and make sure we disable unused switch ports. All of that stuff goes a long way in securing your network. Role-based access control, or RBAC, is a great way to limit or delegate administrative permissions in an IT environment, including in the cloud. So here in Microsoft Azure, we can use roles, which are collections of related permissions that are assigned to users or groups, and we can apply those roles to a part of the Azure hierarchy, such as an entire subscription. So for example, here in the Azure portal, if I type in subscription at the top and go to my Azure subscription, there's my subscription. It's a pay-as-you-go one. When I click to open it up, in the left-hand navigator, I'm going to have something called Access Control IAM. IAM stands for Identity and Access Management. If I click here, then I can click on Role Assignments to see any roles that were assigned at the subscription level. In Microsoft Azure, under the subscription in the hierarchy, we have what's called a resource group in which you can deploy specific related cloud resources, like storage accounts and virtual machines and web apps. So you can apply roles at the subscription level here, and it will flow down to all of the resource groups in the subscription, and of course, by extension, to every resource. Of course, you could be more specific and assign a role to a resource group so that it only applies to the items in that resource group. You could be very granular and, for example, set virtual machine permissions for a cloud technician to a specific individual virtual machine in a resource group. So we're going to go ahead and apply some permissions here for virtual machine management at the subscription level. So to do that, I'm going to click the Add button at the top and choose Role Assignment. First thing I have to do is select the role. So I can click to open the role drop-down list and then filter it by typing in, let's say, the word virtual. And what I'm interested in is the virtual machine contributor role to allow virtual machine management. I can assign this, for example, to a group. I've got a group that I've already created here in Azure Active Directory called East Group 1. So I'm going to select that group. Members of that group will have virtual machine permissions to the subscription. Let's go ahead and save this assignment. After that's done, if I just click refresh here, because we're already under the Role Assignments tab, then East Group shows up here with virtual machine contributor role permissions to this resource, which of course is our subscription. Now in the left-hand navigator here in the Azure portal, I can click on resource groups and I can get a list of resource groups. Now I've got some already here, such as one called testing. I'm going to click to open it up because when I open up a resource group, I can do the same type of thing. I can click on Access Control IAM on the left. I can view any role assignments that were created or that were inherited. Here, East Group 1 shows up with the virtual machine contributor role, but notice it says that it was inherited from the subscription level. So that's very interesting. So in the same way, if I were to go to individual resources within this testing resource group and do the exact same thing, go to the Access Control IAM tab on the left, I would also have a listing for East Group 1. So it flows down through the hierarchy. Now, when we work with roles, we should be aware of the roles that are available. So for example, if I click the Roles tab on the right, it'll take a moment for the list to load up. Here we have a list of all of the various roles that are available, and there are quite a few of them. So for example, why don't we take a look at the one that we have worked on? That would be the virtual machine contributor role. So we could filter by role names at the top to make it easier. Here's the virtual machine contributor role. So if I were to click that up, we have a listing here that shows the assignments for this role, East Group 1. And if I click permissions, here I'll get a list of all the permissions that are applicable in this role. Because remember, a role is simply a collection of related permissions. So if I were to click, for example, on Microsoft Compute, we would see there are some read and write and delete permissions that are applied as appropriate for this particular role. Now, if the built-in roles don't suit your needs, you of course can build your own custom roles. But there's quite a few roles there that are built in Azure, so it's a great way to delegate cloud technician access without giving them full access to everything within your Azure subscription. And we could also look at this from another perspective. So in the left-hand navigator, which I'll click to open up, I could scroll all the way down and select Azure Active Directory. Here I'll click on Groups. We had assigned a role to East Group 1, so I'm going to go ahead and click to open up East Group 1. And if I click Azure Role Assignments over on the left, from here, we have another way of looking at the same configuration. We have a listing showing that the virtual machine contributor role was assigned to this group. And of course, that applies to our subscription, our pay-as-you-go subscription. If we were to go, let's say, back to the default directory breadcrumb trail icon up at the top, and if I were to go look at users, for example, user 1, and if I go into groups, user 1 is a member of East Group 1. So by extension, we would think then that user 1 should have that Azure role assignment for virtual machine contributor. And indeed, they do. So what we're seeing here is that the role was assigned to our pay-as-you-go subscription, and the group membership of East Group 1 for this user is how the user gets those permissions.